Trade shockwaves, the latest on your supply chain. The sudden termination of U.S.-Canada trade negotiations over Canada's digital services tax has sent ripples through North American supply chains, creating immediate implications for category managers across retail and consumer goods industries. The administration's abrupt announcement on Friday, June 27th, that they were ending all trade discussions with Canada over the digital services tax on U.S. tech companies, calling it, quote, a direct and blatant attack on our country, unquote, has introduced new uncertainties into what was already a complex trade environment, especially with our former closest ally. For category managers overseeing everything from fresh produce to processed foods, this development represents more than just diplomatic theater. It signals potential disruption to one of North America's most integrated trade relationships, with over $2.5 billion worth of goods and services crossing the Canadian-U.S. border every single day. Trump threatened to announce new tariffs on Canadian goods within 7 days, building on already substantial trade barriers. The current landscape already includes 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, 25% on autos, and 10% taxes on imports from most countries, with Canada and Mexico facing separate tariffs of as much as 25% under the auspices of stopping fentanyl smuggling. The food sector's vulnerability is particularly acute. The United States accounts for about 60% of Canada's agri-food exports and more than half of Canada's imports, making any trade disruption immediately consequential for both countries' food systems. Category managers must understand the depth of interdependence between U.S. and Canadian food systems. Canada is the largest overseas market for U.S. high-value consumer-oriented products, with exports reaching nearly $19.7 billion in 2022. The relationship flows both ways, with U.S. companies providing more than 50% of Canada's total imports of consumer-oriented products in 2023. Let's take a look. About 50% of Canada's total fruit, nut, and veg imports by value come from the U.S., with 90% of leafy greens imported, most from the U.S., with California being the prime production state. Canada imports about 80% of its fresh fruit and vegetables between November and June. Grains, fruit, vegetables, meat, and related products account for nearly two-thirds, 63.7% of U.S. ag exports to Canada. Imported ingredients are vital inputs to Canadian food and beverage manufacturers, with Canada relying heavily on two-way trade with the U.S. for raw, semi-processed, and processed ingredients. The integration runs deeper than just simple exports. Much of Canada-U.S. ag trade consists of intra-industry trade, meaning that each country exports products to the other within certain sectors, including a number of processed products like dog and cat food for retail sales, mixes and doughs, pastries, cake, bread, and puddings. What the numbers tell us: the Bank of Canada's recent analysis provided sobering projections for widespread tariff scenarios. Under a hypothetical 25% tariff scenario with full retaliation, the average annual GDP growth in Canada in the first year would be about 2.5 percentage points lower than it would otherwise be, with the second year seeing about 1.5 percentage points lower growth. More critically, for category managers, imports from the U.S. of final consumer goods and intermediate inputs used to produce final goods make up about 13% of the CPI basket in Canada, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs on all goods imported from the U.S. would have a direct and indirect impact on consumer prices. We've already witnessed Canadian retailers dropping U.S. brands and promoting Canada-made instead. The Tax Foundation estimates that the tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025, with tariffs affecting approximately $2.3 trillion of U.S. goods, or 71% of U.S. good imports. So what happens next? Well, the first scenario, escalating tariff war between Mexico and Canada would put upward pressure on food prices, as the nations are important sources of vegetables, accounting for 47% of total U.S. imports, and prepared foodstuffs, 42%. For category managers, this translates to immediate cost pressures across produce categories and prepared food segments. Scenario number 2. Supply chain rerouting industries with highly integrated international supply chains, such as the motor vehicle sector, face particular challenges when parts and components cross the Canada-U.S. border several times, as taxing components each time would amplify the increase in production costs. Food processing follows similar patterns, with ingredients often crossing borders multiple times during processing. The third scenario, investment freeze Canadian. Canadian businesses' investment declined significantly due to a combination of weaker export activity and an increase in the cost of imported investment goods from the U.S., with imports comprising about half of overall business investment in machinery and equipment in Canada. Category managers cannot wait for diplomatic resolution. The agriculture sector's resilience will depend on adaptation speed. Any measures that disrupt integrated North American agri-food supply chains will increase the cost of food and other ag products on both sides of the border, making the supply chain flexibility not just advantageous, but essential for food production and supply. Category managers must move beyond traditional supply chain thinking to embrace a more complex, multi-jurisdictional approach to both sourcing and distribution. The companies that will thrive are those that view this disruption not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a permanent shift that requires fundamental strategic reorientation. The broader message is clear. The era of seamless North American trade integration may be ending, and successful category managers must prepare for a more fragmented, costly, and complex supply chain environment.